Welcome to the Faithful and True video podcast number 2. I'm Randy Everett, your co-host, and we're happy to have you back with us on the Faithful and True YouTube channel today. And as we explained last week when our special guest was our director, Debbie Laser, she joined Greg and myself, and we kind of explained that this is a brand new season for us, a brand new adventure for us as we enter the world of YouTube videos with our podcast. So today we have 2 special guests directly from our Faithful and True staff, Chris and Elizabeth Hardesty, who have been on the podcast before. Very popular guests. People are clamoring for more Hardesty content. Please. So Greg and I welcome you today. So happy to have you with us.
Thank you, Randy. Good to be here.
Yeah, great to be here.
And as always, Dr. Miller.
It is good to be back.
It's great to have you here. Behind the cameras, we've got our Director of Social Media, Aaron Wellman, and we're just excited about this whole new venture with Faithful and True videos. So, Greg, what are we going to talk about today?
Well, for those of you that were with us last time, you know that we talked about the change model and specifically how with all that is going on in the world, how we've experienced change over the last 6 months. And Deb and I were able to talk about Virginia Satir and how understanding or knowing what to expect actually can decrease our anxiety. And so we're going to continue talking about the change model, and we're going to make it a little bit more applicable to the work that we do here at Faithful and True, and talk about the change model in the context of betrayal and recovery. And so we're going to be just exploring how does understanding change serve us when it's so personal and so intimate to our lives, not just so global like a pandemic. So, Chris and Elizabeth, we are very glad that you are here.
Thank you.
Thank you. Great to be here.
So just to start with, what do you believe is the importance of understanding the change model in the context of recovery? Why would this be a topic for our podcast?
I think it's a great, it's just an opportunity to kind of understand the phases and the different pieces of recovery you might actually go through as you move through this journey. And so quite often we get questions about, how long is this going to take, or what are the steps, or Chris and Elizabeth, what is your process with couples, with individuals, that kind of thing. And I think it's just like any model. It's not perfect per se. There's no perfect model, but it actually, it really helps us understand. It really helps clients understand what they can expect moving forward in terms of just getting started, and then stages that follow on thereafter. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, and the idea of what to expect. I
You
think
bet.
that is for so many couples. The language that we might use is their lives have exploded, or there's been a crash and burn. So there's so much personal chaos going on that just to have a little bit of information about what to expect can create a sense of comfort and hope that whatever they are experiencing is expected and not surprising. And so therefore there can be some comfort in that.
Mm-hmm.
I agree, Greg. I know for me, just knowing there was a process and that there were people who had gone before and they had walked this path. Because it's true that when we first came in, you don't know right from left, up from down. It's just chaos. And so just knowing that there is a process. We were told, trust the process, but what is that process?
Right.
And so it's just nice to know there is a plan.
Well, and even beyond a plan, that there is a possibility that hope and life and even maybe reconciliation at times is a possibility. Because I know that when our lives exploded and Beth and I were going through so much chaos, at times I didn't believe that there could be life beyond this, that this explosion, this crash and burn would define me for the rest of my life. And so just to hear an invitation to a process where there could be a new opportunity in our relationship was amazing.
I think that's true, and we often work with clients around just kind of building that hope and helping them recognize that is a possibility. Frankly, it's very... the responses that I've seen to this change model are sometimes initially kind of skeptical, negative. I'm not sure that, I look out, this has, numbers of years on it, that sort of thing. And it's like, oh, wow, this looks like a lot of work. And this looks, based on where I'm at right now, I'm not sure that that's a possibility. And yet, and I think sitting across from those folks, we can reassure them that, yes, based on our story based on this, the inspiration that we gained from Mark and Debbie and Greg and Beth and the people that we've been around in recovery. It is possible. Trust that process, hang in there, and just take this one step at a time.
Okay. Well, good. Well, let's talk about it. And we're going to start with stage one, which is the status quo. So status quo is what is comfortable and familiar. It's what we're used to. How would you have described it for yourself or with the other couples that you work with?
I think for us, the word aimless seems to come to mind. We were just surviving, just going through the motions a little bit. We didn't know what we didn't know. There was a lot of naivety. There was a lot of numbness, disconnect, but didn't even really maybe realize even the layers of disconnect that were going on between us.
I think and a significant lack of awareness in that. We're just kind of going through the motions.
Right.
And for us, that would have been we've been married 19 years now, so that would have been about 13 years into our marriage. And there was early on in our marriage, a few years after, we were married, there was a partial disclosure, so there was some information there, and then really a pretty significant divergence just in terms of any sort of emotional or spiritual intimacy that maybe the what little bit we had at the time. And that just sort of compounded that as well. And so we're talking about basically a decade of just sort of going through the motions. We had our children in the ampersand, right? So there were pieces of this that were exciting and truly a blessing and so forth. And yet it wasn't, this definitely wasn't God's, the best version of ourselves according to God's will and what He had for us in our lives, for sure.
I kind of see that couples that we work with fall into different categories. So there are those couples that really seem connected. They've enjoyed each other. They would say that their marriage has been satisfying, and then they discover this addiction, and that's really disorienting because for the spouse specifically, they're like questioning, I thought we were doing well, I thought this was good, and now all of a sudden I'm discovering this new information about the addiction. We also have couples that it kind of sounds like where y'all were. It was kind of value neutral. There were some good times, but there wasn't a lot of anger or hostility. There wasn't a lot of injury being done through arguing and fighting. And like you said, you were satisfied with it because you didn't really know there was something better or more, something more possible. But we also work with couples that even prior to the discovery of the addiction, there was a lot of pain and chaos and arguing and fighting. So one of the things just to acknowledge is that everybody's status quo is different.
Yes.
But status quo is just what we're used to. It's what is familiar. It's the patterns that we have in our relationship.
Yeah. Or even almost like the good enough is okay. This is as good as it's going to get. This is what we're going to settle for. For us, as Chris said, he did disclose some things early in marriage, and yet I didn't know what to do with that information. We tried to get some counseling, but it was not the right kind of help. And as I've come to know, I'm a stuffer, instead of knowing how to really deal with my emotions and my needs in healthy ways, I stuffed them and just thought, well, we're just going to move on, right? We're going to have a family. We're just going to make it. And it leaks out. It caught up with me as we kind of move into the next stage.
Yeah. I think more and more it became, as we move towards this next stage, it became more and more the land of numb, more and more just coping. Right before we kind of got into the crash and burn, which would be the next stage, this new information piece. I recall Elizabeth had just been on a cruise with a friend of hers, and they were doing their thing on the cruise, and then we were at a beach home. You had to get a family trip, out in Virginia, and I think Elizabeth and I had just copious amounts of wine and beer just for the two of us. I mean, it was just like, I remember my folks came over and they were just like, they just were scratching their head. They were, what is going on here? And it was inevitable that something was going to, we were getting close. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, and what's interesting is once we get the new information, we're able then to put some pieces together, kind of like we are able to see life through a new lens. And so, men come to our workshop and they come in a variety of different states, depending on what's happened. Some of them have gotten caught. They got exposed. The new information came because somebody found an email or computer history. So somebody stumbled into the new information. Sometimes it's because the man decided that he was no longer going to live that way, and he begins to share a bit more. And we often talk about the idea that when there is new information, if it leaks out over time, instead of building trust, that actually destroys trust. I tell the story at the workshop where when I was exposed, I was in a meeting and there were others there, and I was being challenged with part of the information. And in my head was this voice of a friend who I had had a conversation with a couple of weeks earlier, and he was saying, not about my situation because he didn't know anything about me, but he was just saying, if you ever have the chance to tell the truth, you tell the whole truth. And fortunately, in that moment, I had this guy's voice in my head, and I had this, I think it was the Spirit of God saying, this is your chance to tell the truth. Wow. And all of that to just acknowledge is however the information is shared, that becomes part of the process. So if, it's the installment plan of truth, that it does impact, at least for a season, what the recovery is going to look like. What would you say are the words or the descriptions of what it's like for a couple in this season of getting the new information?
Can you talk a little bit about maybe the buildup that you've seen for some of the wives as well? So there's
almost like you were saying, Greg, that we almost see two different types of how this can show up, and one of those is more of, you said, the crash and burn, where the information just comes out all at once. You don't see it coming. You really feel like we're connected, we're thriving, we're doing well, and all of a sudden something comes out where all of this information hits. And other times, as was true for us, it really is a building over time where there's a leak of information or some information, and the pain just becomes so great. The wheels, I like to say, the wheels start to come off, of this is no longer sustainable. And really the pain of staying the same or continuing to live in the status quo becomes too great. And there needs to be some type of intervention. Something needs to change. And so I feel like the women I work with, it seems like it's those two different scenarios.
Yeah, and so Elizabeth basically intervened in our story, and she said, Chris, I love you, but I'm not in love with you. We're going to separate. We're going to divorce. And I came to find out later, this was after quite a bit of just contemplation about what were your next steps going to be, and it was that build-up. Well, I think we often talk to the ladies and the men, I guess, about just trusting their intuition, trusting themselves. And I think Elizabeth knew, even though she did know that there really was a lot going on under the surface. And so we separated for, I think it was 5 or 6 months. We were out of house. But in that very first month, there was a wrestling with this idea of integrity. Do you want to be well? Do you, and I started to, get introduced to some of the concepts of faithful and true. But in terms of this new information, I remember getting an email one day from Elizabeth, and we were resolved at that point that, the marriage was over. But there was a line in the email that said, the greatest gift you could give me is the truth. And that really hit me, and I thought, well, okay, that's the least I can do. There's not much you realize that you're powerless.
Right.
When at the outset of recovery, and then, even now, we don't have that much agency over, things outside of ourselves, that's for sure. And so I thought, well, the one thing I could do right now for sure is just at least begin to articulate what is true about our situation, what was true about what happened in our marriage. And so that ultimately we don't recommend it at Faithful and True. We don't recommend a disclosure that's not guided and stewarded by counselors and so forth. But I spent a few days, actually. I think I took time off of work even and spent a few days in the local library just writing down the story and writing down what happened. And I invited her into a conversation, and that was how the new information was discovered, was ultimately conveyed in our case.
Randy, I know that you are on the front lines, that when people call, you're the one that they talk to. Are you able, just in the way they present themselves and how they engage you, many times are you able to identify where they are in this process? Has the new information just come out? And do they kind of express some of their anxiety and fear over the phone when they reach out to call Faithful and True?
At times, Greg, by the time that they've gotten to the point that they're actually calling us, there's always two sides to the coin, because sometimes it's the wife calling us because she fully recognizes the problem, and the husband might be in denial, and he just doesn't want to face that she can't possibly know everything I've done. You know what I mean? And then there are the men that have taken account of themselves, like Chris just did, and just goes, oh man, I've done so much. I've done, so then they turn to us for help. And half the time, you can almost measure the shame and guilt that they're carrying on their shoulders. And that's true when the men walk through our front door on the Thursday of the Men of Valor workshop. You can almost visibly see, man, you have an anvil on your shoulders of shame and guilt. And by the time that they're done, and we're going to talk about this later, one of our guests on a future podcast, Rick Underwood, did his whole PhD thesis on our workshop and the reduction of shame and guilt. But those men, when they leave Saturday, are different men.
Right.
And so the ones that I'm dealing with on the phone, the authenticity of their problem is evident. Okay. And I've got extreme confidence in how our staff knows how to address what's devastating their lives. And so, and it always comes down to the one statement that Mark Laser, as our founder, and Mark used to do this podcast with me, and Mark would say, there's no sin that God is unwilling to forgive.
Right. Well, it's one of the things that we talk about is truth sets us free. Even painful truth sets us free. And the truth is never harmful. It may be hurtful, but it's the lying and the deception that is harmful. And so, however the new information is shared in the coupleship, as we understand that to the extent that I am known is the extent that I can be loved. And so whatever secrets I'm holding on to, whatever information I'm not sharing is actually limiting my ability to be engaged in the coupleship. So that's why, we support and encourage couples to do a directed full disclosure where they can begin to share their story in a safe way. And as Randy has said, so many of the men who first show up are so weighed down by the shame of what they've done that we want to offer a safe space for them to begin to get free. And we also acknowledge doing that with our spouse is incredibly difficult.
Yeah.
So the courage that it took for you to think through your story and identify your story, and then also for you, Elizabeth, to be willing to hear that is just a huge point of moving forward. And that brings us to the next stage. So after we get the new information, we immediately go into chaos. And I love that word because it is so clarifying about what couples are experiencing early in their recovery. So what does chaos look like for the couples that come and see you, and what did y'all's chaos look like?
Yeah, these days I can still kind of feel it, as I think back to chaos. I mean, really, it's shattered. You're just shattered. Everything maybe that you had thought was going to be true or hoped for or wished for is just laying in crumbles all around you. And part of you maybe has hope. At least for me, I didn't have hope in our marriage, but I began to have hope for myself. As I came in here, I began to see there could be another side of this for me. And at the same time, incredible sadness, incredible anger, incredible fear. It's just such a mix of emotions.
And just for my own understanding, did you start coming to Faithful and True prior to getting all the information? Or was it after Chris shared the information that you started coming to Faithful and True?
Yeah, it was an interesting month, I would say. So it was early September, a number of years ago now, that I had...
Labor Day.
Okay,
Yep,
Labor Day.
September 2nd.
A number of years ago that I had asked Chris to move out and said we were going to separate. And I came to Faithful and True. I had a friend of mine from high school who had been here, and I just thought they'll be my help, And at that point... I didn't really care if Chris came or didn't come. I just knew that I wanted to be here. And we were living an hour and a half away at the time. And he thought, that's a long way to travel for counseling I don't even need. So I came down. And because we were separated with 3 young children, I met with Susie, one of the therapists here. And she had said, would Chris be willing to come to set up a separation, to help you, the both of you really set up a great separation, to help the kids thrive? And that got Chris in the door.
Mm-hmm. It did. I mean, that seemed reasonable. That we were, I was out of house at that point, and it seemed reasonable that we would, if we're going to separate, let's do this, the best way possible. And so that's what, now in hindsight, now I like to think I got sort of tricked into the door of faithful and true, but not I mean, it was God's provision and will that I would come through the doors. But yeah, that's how I was originally, got in here.
Well, and what's true is the invitation to recovery comes in a variety of different
That's right.
forms.
That's right. Yeah.
And for a lot of people, the invitation that they can hear is to be a better parent.
Exactly.
And this
That's
idea
right.
that if this is for my children, then absolutely. Because what I hear you saying is at that point, there wasn't a lot of hope for your marriage.
No, right.
So coming to work on your marriage wouldn't have really been
No.
a response. But to say we want to be better parents and love our children well through this pain, then that's something that I can be open to.
Yeah.
You bet. And that we definitely agreed on.
Yeah.
For sure.
And I would just say, that day, Chris picked up the Healing the Wounds book and began to read that on his own. And I really, even from a distance, I began to see a wrestling within him. And I remember you even saying, Chris, that there was a line in the sand that you drew. Where a lot of it was for the children. You really didn't believe there was hope in our marriage. But there was a big part of you said, that really wrestled with, can I tell the whole truth? Do I want to tell the whole truth? And a lot of that was, it's time for this to be broken. For the children.
Yep. And I think then that this disclosure that I'm talking about, this kind of this informal, self-guided disclosure, was a couple weeks later. So there was so Elizabeth was in the door before she really knew the full story. And actually I was in the door before I knew the full story.
Right.
It really wasn't until I actually started to think about what did the history look like before I started putting the pieces together. And I think that also begins to characterize Elizabeth's comment about me picking up. It was actually suggested in that session, Chris, check out Mark's book, Healing the Wounds. And so, I thought, well, okay, I'll take a copy back to the place I was staying. I couldn't put the book down that night. It just resonated. I'm just, wow, someone understands this issue. And then there's hope here, and it just felt like, and then actually just some sort of a plan. I'm kind of a planful, goal-oriented guy. And I thought, well, this actually looks like it could be doable, but ultimately there's some hope here around. I know that I'm not going to be with Elizabeth. At least it felt that way at the time. But I can be a man of integrity for myself and for my children, to your point, Greg. And sometimes you hear people talk about addiction work in terms of a period of discovery and then a period of recovery. And I feel like this stage of chaos, once you're kind of the first piece when couples come through the door is we're thinking about crisis management. We're thinking about stabilizing people. We're thinking about basic needs and making sure people are just foundationally, they're just okay before they can ever start doing any kind of what we would say, I think, discovery, really, even before you move into the recovery piece. And so, like, writing down my story was a discovery piece. And then we really start to work with couples on, like, in this stage on, it's just a lot of education around what is recovery? What will recovery look like? How does Faithful and True approach recovery? We start talking about the three-legged stool and how, there's a his recovery and a her recovery and the couple's recovery and that sort of thing.
Well, and
So-
I think one of the things I hear that it's so significant is even in this stage of chaos, it is expected. In fact, we tell couples that will be primarily the first year of recovery will be chaotic. And what makes a difference is if there can be a glimmer of hope. And the hope comes in a variety of different forms. And sometimes it's not hope for the relationship. That may be one of the later things that comes. But when you can have hope for yourself, when you can have hope for your children. I often said when Beth and I were separated, we had little or no contact. And yet what I knew was I would be a better dad if I was out of the house and in recovery than in the house and in my addiction. So my hope wasn't for Beth and I, it was for me, that I could become this man that God desired for me to be, and I could be the dad that God desired. But in the midst of the chaos, having that hope is foundational.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And, for Chris and I, within the first month, he came to the men's workshop, maybe about a month after, October, probably of that same year.
It was October. It would have been about 6 or 7 weeks later. Yeah.
And I came to the women's intensive about a month after that. I mean, and talk about just our own journeys. There really did become just this individualized hope of there is another side of this for me. I don't have to limp through life anymore. There really can be a life on the other side of this.
Yeah. Okay, well, that's a good place for us to stop.
Yes.
We're going to continue this conversation in our next podcast because we don't want to leave people in chaos.
Right.
We want to let them know that there is more of the journey. And we also want to validate that for those of you that are in this stage of chaos, that's expected, and that there can even be peace in the chaos when your life feels out of control.
Yes.
Well, and I was remiss at the beginning of the podcast not to mention, I thought, what if someone has come along and they're seeing this podcast as their first Faithful and True podcast? And we didn't establish the fact that Chris and Elizabeth we consider them the poster couple for Faithful and True because they have their own healing journey, as we're all witnessing as we hear their story, which is so real and so authentic. But so as you're watching this, they're not only gifted counselors for us that see our clients and see couples, but they themselves have walked this journey and gone through the Faithful and True school of recovery and of healing. And on the other side is all of this is a wonderful renewed relationship, great parents to 3 great kids. And the program works.
Right.
So if you're seeing this podcast and go, I really like what the Hardestys had to say, they are a very strong option for you to contact Faithful and True and say, I'd like to start getting the counseling that I've been desiring.
So it's a stay tuned.
It's a stay
More
tuned
to come.
because there's part 2 of this podcast coming up. So thanks very much for being with us today.
Our pleasure.
And to all of you watching and listening to the Faithful and True podcast, we thank you for being with us. We hope that you'll continue to watch us on the Faithful and True YouTube channel. Like us. We would appreciate that because there's some benefits for us for you liking the podcast. And we hope that until we join you again, that this coming week for you will be a week that's filled with many blessings and great vision.